Good day, duelists, and welcome to another exciting deck profile, this time built around one of the all-time Duel Masters greats, Alcadeias, Lord of Spirits. Now, Alcadeias used to be a scary big bad wolf in the old days of Playground Duel Masters, but if you're playing the game in 2025, you probably know that it struggles to find a place in today's competitive metagame landscape. It's not like it doesn't see experimentation or even occasional results, but it's just always kinda awkward to build a deck around it. The main thing holding this card back is that, well, most if not all of the angel commands just kinda suck. I mean, your options are Cyforce, which is just a Belix effect slapped on a 7 mana meatball. You have Eris, which is okay-ish, but countering darkness creatures is not a great effect, because darkness is not really a civilization that focuses on creatures in the first place. What else? There's Valkyr, I guess. It's a blocker. Its goal is to stop aggro, but it costs 5 mana, while Rush already kills you on turn 4. Like, these cards are okay on the playground, but they just don't cut it for competitive play. So the classic strategy of cram some random angel commands in the deck and build your entire game plan around Alcadeias simply doesn't work. But there is a different way that you can go about building an Alcadeias deck. Instead of centering the deck around this one card, you make a solid deck that runs solid cards, has solid defense and a solid value engine, and just uses Alcadeias as just one tool in the toolbox, a tool that you can use against certain decks in certain situations, but that you don't have to use if the circumstances don't line up. With that understanding out of the way, we can make sense of the actual cards in the deck. We start with the value generators in Mistrias and Charmilla, arguably the most important cards in the deck. Charmilla can search a creature once per turn, and Mistrias draws a card every time another creature is summoned. If any of these stick on the board for even 1 or 2 turns, they can snowball the game and win all by themselves with just how much card advantage they provide. The crucial part is that we have 8 of these. And that's important because the opponent might generally be able to deal with 1 of them, maybe even 2, but at some point they run out of removal, so if you just keep throwing these out, 1 of them will probably stick. At least that's the hope. Of course it won't work every time, but hey, no deck in Duel Masters can win every single duel, right? And adding to the value engine we have Magris, Vizier of Magnetism, and Rumbling Terrahorn. These have an on-summon effect of drawing a card or searching out a creature respectively. Again, the idea is to use these to overwhelm the opponent with tempo and card advantage. You play a Terrahorn, search another Terrahorn, then play double Magris the following turn, and all of a sudden you have a massive board. And like any massive board, it can die to fire mass removal, but then again, even if it does, you're still left with a massive hand that you can redeploy for even more value. And with the value generation cards out of the way, let's look at the RAM package with Poisonous Mushroom and of course a Bronze Arm Tribe. Ramping up mana is very strong in general, not only in Duel Masters but in pretty much any card game, but in this deck especially, it's a must because not only does it allow us to get to our Alcadeias faster, but crucially, it allows us to play our value generators 1 turn earlier, and the earlier they are played, the higher the chance they stick. In particular, turn 2 Mushroom into turn 3 Charmilla is an incredibly powerful opener, because there aren't many meta answers to Charmilla at 3 mana. There is Miraculous Snare and that's pretty much it. Soul Swap is also technically an answer, but it still leaves us with something on board afterwards. And speaking of Soul Swap, of course we run a full playset because, well, it's arguably the single most broken card in English Duel Masters, but also because it unlocks so many crazy plays. For example, you can play turn 2 Poisonous Mushroom and then on turn 3 you'll be at 4 mana, so you can swap in a Mistrias, and again, not many answers to Mistrias on 3 mana. And we'll come back to Soul Swap as soon as we talk about more cards. For example, Skysword. We run a full playset of these. Skysword sets up a new shield and ramps us up in mana in the process, which is an incredibly strong effect. Combined with Soul Swap, this is one of the most solid anti-aggro defenses in Duel Masters, while helping us to get to the magic 8 mana number, and we'll see why that's important in just a bit. By the way, sorry about going back and forth between cards so much in this video, but this deck has many synergies and they all tie in with each other, so it's impossible to talk about everything at once. Anyway, we're almost done by the card by card, continuing with an absolute classic, which is Holy Awe. Of course, you'd expect to see this here, a very versatile card, can act as a board clear, can clear the way through blocker walls for ending the game, and can also act as a life-saving shield trigger. Honestly, I'd probably run a third copy in here if I could find a space for it, but I just couldn't bring myself to cut anything else. Next up, we have a single copy of Terra Dragon Archi de la Serna. When the Lacerna is discarded, it gets put into the battle zone instead, and oftentimes a free double breaker in these tempo-based strategies turns into a game win. Here's the thing about the Lacerna though, you're not expecting this to happen too often. I mean, it's a one-off, and after it happens once, your opponent will be very cautious about discarding you in the future, but that's exactly the point. The point of the Lacerna is not that it summons itself, but that it guards the other cards in your hand. Like, you can search it up one time with Terrahorn or Charmeleon, and then the opponent will never play another Cranium Clamp or Lost Soul again because they know it's in your hand. And that means your Alcadeias is now safe in your hand, which is otherwise a massive weakness of this deck. Because Alcadeias is not easy to summon, it will probably lay in your hand for a while, which makes it vulnerable to discard, and De La Serna helps fix that issue. You'll notice that pretty much every single card in this deck has a very specific goal or addresses a specific weakness or gap in the deck strategy, and that's what makes this version so strong. Light Nature Alcadeias is by no means a new concept. I mean, I was playing it all the way back in those old GBA games, but it's how the deck is built that really matters. Anyway, the last card to talk about is of course Alcadeias himself. Like we talked about, this can be an instant win condition against certain spell heavy decks, and against other decks like aggro decks or decks running things like Coral, you can just charge it guilt free and the deck can perform just fine without it. But what does Alcadeias evolve on top of? I mean, so far we haven't seen any angel commands. Where for our very final card of the deck, we're running 4 copies of Ularus Punishment Elemental. And I'm sorry I kept this essential reveal for the very end, but we really needed to see the big picture of how the deck operates to really understand Ularus. This creature can reveal your opponent's shields and the number of them equal to how many creatures you have in the battle zone, and since the deck strategy relies on swarming the board with efficient creatures, this will often, when played on curve, reveal 3 or even more of your opponent's shields. And if you're like me, you might think this effect is underwhelming, but let me tell you, you don't appreciate it enough until you actually get to play with it. The thing about these tempo mid-range decks is it's oftentimes difficult to know when to attack. Like, you might have 2 or 3 creatures on board and you'll go, do I swing in now and give them card advantage, or can I afford to wait until I play Alcadeias? What if I hit a shield trigger? How does that change the game dynamic? And you'll be there for minutes on end having to plan 3 turns ahead in order to account for every possibility. Ularus allows you to bypass all of that. You play him on board, flip all of your opponent's shields, which oftentimes allows you to attack once or twice right away because you can guarantee you'll give them some useless cards, and oftentimes as a result of that you'll be able to go for game in the following 1 or 2 turns with little to no risk. And of course, if you flip the shields and see there's a whole bunch of triggers, you can go, alright, this aggro game plan will not work, I have to switch to the Alcadeias game plan, and you can play accordingly. And Ularus, by the way, is why I was saying it's very important for the deck to reach 8 mana, because when you play Ularus, your opponent probably knows what you're up to and they're going to do everything in their power to destroy it. You cannot reliably count on Ularus surviving 1 turn so it can be evolved. But if you're on 8 mana, you can tap 3 to play Soul Swap, you Soul Swap in a creature for Ularus, and now you have 6 mana, which means you can directly play your Alcadeias from hand. This is yet another reason why Soul Swap is such an important card in the deck. And that's pretty much it. A mid-range deck focused on value generation that has 2 alternative game plans: swarm the board and apply pressure, or summon Alcadeias and win the game that way. The key insight is that the deck doesn't go all out on the Alcadeias game plan, as that is a recipe for disaster in the modern Duel Masters landscape. Which, by the way, is why 4 Ularus is enough. You don't need more angel commands, you don't need to dilute your deck with clunky cards, you just play good, solid, standalone cards that's just enough to unlock the Alcadeias plan. Now, there's a whole bunch of other cards that you can consider adding to this list if you want to make it your own. Options include Crazed Valkyrie, since you are playing 8 initiates in the deck, Petrova as just a solid tempo pressure applying play on turn 5, you could play Ikaz in combination with that as well to better combat various rush decks, And even Techno Totem is a card that sounds good on paper, although I did have it in the first version of the deck and it just didn't feel like it had enough impact. Even a single copy of Valkyr is not too terrible if the environment you're playing is heavily aggro focused. These are all solid options, but overall I personally felt like this version that I have right here is better without them, but of course, as I always say, feel free to experiment and make the list your own. One last thing to discuss is how this version compares to Halfar's IDC winning list, which included water. The loss of Aqua Surfer in combination with Emerald definitely takes a hit on the deck's performance against aggressive decks, but the pure light nature version compensates by having a better matchup against other decks just by including more value generating cards. As per usual, when comparing deck lists, both have their positives and negatives, and which one is better entirely depends on the play environment, but I personally tend to prefer this version just a little bit more. It's also more fun to play in my opinion. Sticking a Charmeleon on board early and watching hope leave the opponent's eyes as they can't deal with it is simply glorious. There is one card that heavily counters this deck though, and we cannot end the video without talking about it, and that is Photoside Lord of Wastes. An early Photoside pretty much shuts down your entire game plan, and the only real out to it in this deck is Soul Swap, which is less than ideal. Thankfully, not all that many decks play Photoside, although I personally try to shoehorn it into everything, and even the decks that do play it at a single copy max, so statistically it's not that big of a concern, but it does really hurt when you see one just being slammed on the board. And I think that just about covers it. I know Alcadeias is a fan favorite, and there is just something beautiful about being able to, 20 years after the game's death, be able to craft meta decks using this amazing creature. By the way, if you enjoyed this deck profile, I also have one for a Belgium list that I drove to a 3rd place finish in a recent IDC tournament, so if that sounds interesting, make sure to give it a watch. With all of that out of the way, have a great day duelists, and I hope I'll see you next time. Take care.